We know from looking at centuries of English colonization that religious justifications remain front and center, but again and again, they are pushed aside for commercial goals, financial aims, greed, and then also just people on the ground in these colonial spaces ignoring idealistic orders from London. Even in the 17th century, someone like King Charles II, who is investing in the transatlantic slave trade, who is supporting the spread of slavery, he still thinks, well, maybe we should really be converting people. We should be converting enslaved people and Native Americans because that's just part of what we should be doing as creating an English Protestant empire.
This is the Moorish Podcast, where Caribbean history meets culture and cuisine. Brooke, thank you so much for joining me today on the Moorish Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I have been deep into your book that we're going to talk about today because there is so much information in here. We're not going to be able to cover all of it today, but we're going to high level the information in your book, why it matters, why you wrote this, talk a little bit about your research process. The book is called The Crown's Silence: The Hidden History of the British Monarchy and Slavery in the Americas. Before we dive right in, can you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, my name is Brooke Newman. I'm an associate professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I teach and research essentially early modern British history, the history of the British Atlantic world, and the history of slavery and its legacies. And probably for the last about 10 years or so, I segued into focusing more so on the monarchy. But my interest in the monarchy grew out of my primary interest in empire, Caribbean history, and the history of slavery. So essentially just sort of asking, wait a minute, were the royals involved? How much were they involved? Why is there no book about this? So that I really ended up writing the book that I wanted to read, essentially. That's what got me started on this project.
And this book took some time to come to fruition.
Definitely. My first book is about Jamaica, and it is, an academic book. It looks at the legal and social development of slave society in Jamaica over a couple hundred years. And while I was working on that book, I kept thinking about the involvement of the monarchy because I would see references to, Charles II wants this to happen, or the Prince Regent is concerned there might be a revolt among free people of African and mixed ancestry, partnering with enslaved people in Jamaica, and they may lose the colony just like the French lost Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti. And so I saw these things kind of peppered through the archival evidence. And I was aware, as historians are, that the royal family was involved in obviously in the founding of the Royal African Company. It's called the Royal African Company for a reason, but there wasn't very much in between. Essentially, in between the founding of this company, we know they're involved, and then the end of the story. And so that is really what led me to focus on this project. And the first place I started, and this was after I'd already spent a lot of time in multiple archives working on the Jamaica book, was the Royal Archives in Windsor Castle in the Round Tower. And so my first archival visit was in 2017. So it's been a while that, I've been working on this book. I was doing research. And I spent about 6 weeks working in the Round Tower, just like going through all the royal papers. And at that point, most of it was not digitized. However, now a lot of those papers are digitized. And it's such a fascinating resource for your listeners. If they're interested, if you just Google Georgian Papers Program, you will be able to go to a website where there are many, many papers digitized from the royal collections, primarily from the reign of George III. But it is a rich collection, and it's pretty easy to search, and you can pull up PDFs of letters and all sorts of things, and then download the entire PDF. So it is an amazing public database, but that was not there yet when I started out.
In season 1 of the podcast, we talked to a couple of people from the Slave Voyages Consortium. And one of the things that came out is the British were the most prolific when it comes to human trafficking to the Caribbean.
Right.
But it didn't start that way. When you open the book in 1564, and Queen Elizabeth. Can we talk about Queen Elizabeth first and Hawkins?
Yes, whenever I was working on this book too, I knew that I had to really delve into Elizabeth and not just in the sense of like, yes, she did invest, we know, in these voyages, but trying to put her in her context for readers, because I wanted them to see, why would this monarch who is young, she's a woman, she's Protestant, and she is the head of a country that doesn't have a lot of money, that has a very small navy at the time, and that is surrounded by, as far as she's concerned, threatening, more important, more powerful European countries that are also Catholic, especially the Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal, who are effectively, going out, colonizing the Americas, already trading in West Africa. The Portuguese are establishing various forts along the coast of West Africa. And by the time Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558, the Spanish already have an empire in the Americas. There's already a transatlantic slave trade that the Portuguese are dominating and so forth. And so for her subjects, their goal is to essentially get a piece of that, to profit off of these trading networks, or to get involved in establishing their own trading networks if possible. But they're really reliant upon entrepreneurial merchants, people like John Hawkins, who was based in Plymouth. He was a merchant adventurer. He was someone who essentially set out of his own accord to head for the region, now known as Sierra Leone, in order to capture enslaved people and bring them to Spanish America and sell them. And he does do this successfully in the early 1560s. And when he comes back to England and the Queen and her court hear about his success, that he has, essentially stuck it to the Spanish by getting involved in the transatlantic slave trade, going to Philip II's empire, where he does not want the English to be profiting off of his empire, and trading in people, she's interested. And I think that there is a misperception that Elizabeth was conflicted in some way, that she had these moral qualms. And I did address that in the book, because that is a line that was circulated by abolitionists. And I think it's a very interesting point, because, of course, when you are trying to rewrite your national history, you don't want to blame some of the first English investment in the transatlantic slave trade on a Tudor monarch. You want, especially one that, is celebrated, you want to blame just some guy. It's Hawkins, it's his fault. And so it's a very effective line, this idea that she thought, this potentially could result in like divine punishment if people were not willing to be trafficked. But there's no evidence that she actually said any of that. Instead, we know that she gave Hawkins a ship, the Jesus of Lubeck. It was 700 tons. It was a massive warship. It had seen better days, but nonetheless, it was one of the larger vessels in her navy. She stocked it with men and supplies, and she essentially allowed Hawkins to fly her royal standard at will and go on this voyage. And what I find to be so fascinating about the initial kind of arrangement between them is that, like so many monarchs who come after her successors, they don't have liquid money to offer anyone. What they have are things like vessels. They have material goods that they can kind of hand off to someone. In exchange, they will get a cut of the proceeds. So she is absolutely relying upon the success of this venture. And she knows this is a slaving venture. And that is both the second voyage and then also the subsequent third voyage that she invests in with him and gives him two ships, the Jesus and the Minion, knowing this time that she's going to be reinvesting in transatlantic slaving, and she's already profited to a significant extent from this. So I think it's very clear from the archival evidence that she knew what she was investing in. She thought this is a lucrative way of making money. At the same time, it doesn't put a lot of risk on her head, because it's Hawkins who's leading this expedition, and she can always claim that she didn't know, exactly what was happening. And that's what's something that she specialized in. She tended to let people borrow her vessels, and then she would turn the other way and say things like, oh, well, they were just going to legally trade somewhere in West Africa where the Portuguese are not dominant. They were never going to your empire in the Americas, even though, of course, that was the intended venture. And even there's, surviving letters from Hawkins to the Queen, making it very clear what he intends to do.
She didn't outwardly claim that this is what she was doing. She was doing it in an underhanded way, giving him the resources and the ships, pretending that she wasn't involved.
Right, which is what she would say when the Spanish or Portuguese ambassadors would come to her court and they would question her, and she would always assure them, of course, I am respecting, your monopoly, your claims, because she could not, at that time especially, she knew she did not have the financial or military power to stand up to the Iberian powers. And so the only way she could really effectively make any money off of this illicit slaving venture was if she was kind of underhanded, providing supplies and ships and profiting on the side, but then also being able to wash her hands of it if she needed to. And that is exactly what she did. And I mean, I think that is one of the reasons why she has such an interesting legacy as a monarch, because it's hard not to admire the fact that here's a woman who is savvy. She speaks all of these languages. She's actually quite intimidating, and she's really good at kind of manipulating people and pretending as though I'm just a woman. But she's very clever and cunning and trying to in any way profit off of the fact that she has these subjects who are clamoring for international trade and eventually for colonization schemes in the Americas, which she also cannot afford to support herself or to launch, but that she does, want other people to go out and spend their own money and time to try to plant colonies and establish trading relationships, all over the globe, essentially.
I want to take a quick step back because we're talking about the Americas, and I want to just clarify what you mean by the Americas and what the Americas was at this time.
So at this time, you have the Spanish who are in part of South America. They're also in what is now Mexico. They're also in the Caribbean. And so when someone like Hawkins is going from Sierra Leone to, quote, the Americas, he's primarily interested in going to Hispaniola and places where he thinks he's going to be able to trade and enslave people to these colonies where they need laborers, where they've already enslaved indigenous people and or driven them into, extinction through genocide, either purposefully or inadvertently through the spreading of disease. And there's also in South America and Mexico, there's mines where indigenous people are also made to work in various silver mines, dive for pearls. So there's a lot of enslavement already going on in that larger region of various indigenous groups. And it's really the use of all of these indigenous people and killing off so many millions of people that leads them to ultimately make deals with the Portuguese, who have established relationships along the West African coast to start bringing over new laborers through the transatlantic slave trade. And this is something that the English are aware of. They understand that the Spanish have essentially claimed these different regions, but there's also, they know that there's a lot more territory out there and they haven't yet mapped it. They still believe that, what is now mainland North America, the eastern seaboard, potentially could be right next to Asia if they just kept sailing, northeast. And so there's still this sense that if they can move into that region, they can find a space where they can have a potential base, be that in the Caribbean itself, in areas where there's not a lot of settlement by European colonizers, or in parts of North America that have been unclaimed by the Spanish. So north of modern day Florida, essentially.
When we look at this time period, there is this conversation that there was trading of goods versus people.
Mm-hmm.
And how did those intermingle?
It intermingled in the sense that it depended on what people were seeking to trade and what networks they had already tapped into. And so, for example, for a group like the Portuguese, who are, they were holders of the asiento, and that is a legal contract. So they have permission to essentially sell enslaved people in Philip II's Spanish Empire. And so that is a contract specifically to bring enslaved people. They're going to have other goods as well that they're going to trade, but their primary task is going to be trafficking of people. Whereas the English, who initially in the 16th century, other than Hawkins, are trying to establish trading relationships in places like West Africa, they're thinking more about what goods can I immediately sell in England or re-export to Europe that will be worth a lot of money. And that is stuff like gold, obviously, but elephant tusks, animal hides, pepper. Eventually, they're interested in things like ginger, indigo, redwood, which is used at the time for textiles to make high quality red dye. So these are products that they are keenly interested in setting up trading networks. And actually, most of the story of English trade with West Africa, at least initially, is about trying to dabble in hunting for gold mines, which is something they're interested in doing, and then primarily trading in those products, gold, ivory, dyewoods. And that is what some of these really early companies are doing, and with the exception of Hawkins. So he is really in some ways very unique with his plan to profit, because his plan is initially to eventually convince the Spanish that he is legitimate, that he's not a pirate, and that he wants to actually provide enslaved people in addition to the supply they're already receiving from the Portuguese. So he's not asking them if he can do that, he's just doing this. And this is what really outrages the Spanish, because, who are you to think you're just going to set up this, secondary trading network? But once that fails, essentially, once the Spanish knock him down, then for several decades after that, the English are much more interested in pursuing other types of trade with West Africa, because the Portuguese claim a monopoly over, vast swaths of the West African coast, but they can't actually police all of that territory. In addition to the fact that they're not in control. You've got all of these different African groups, different kingdoms, they're all warring with each other. And then the Portuguese are only there once they have made negotiations with local rulers, and the English are in a similar position. And so they're trying to do something similar initially. And there's some really fascinating quotes from pretty early on in the 17th century where like Richard Jobson is one, and he was part of the Guinea Company. And this is a company that is chartered by James II in 1618, and then rechartered again in 1631 by King Charles II. And they are not interested initially in dealing in human commodities. They're interested in the other commodities that we mentioned. And there's a story in this early 1620s where one of them was offered enslaved women to purchase. And he has this famous quote that has been repeated for centuries where he says, "We are not a people who deal in these kinds of commodities." But what he really meant, and I mentioned this in my book, is this is not what we're looking for right now. Like, this is not our goal. We're not the Portuguese. We don't have anywhere to essentially vent these human commodities. They don't have a network set up. But as soon as they do, as soon as there is a network, immediately the English get involved in slave trading. And that, I think, is a really important part of this larger story, that yes, they're behind, but as soon as there is a market, essentially by the 1630s, they've already begun to colonize islands in the Caribbean, parts of North America. There's, people in the Chesapeake who are interested in coerced laborers. There's Barbados. We know that they have the sugar revolution in the 1640s, but even before that, in Barbados specifically, they're already bringing people and essentially consigning them to slavery for life if they are of indigenous or African descent. So there's this evolving understanding that people can be enslaved for life and be put into hereditary slavery if they are not Christian, and if they're so-called heathens, which are a lot of other people as far as they're concerned, but essentially opportunistically, they're like, well, who can we get a hold of? Where can we buy people? For how much? And how can we make them work and essentially produce all of this profit for us as we're clearing the land? When you think about a place like Barbados, they had to go in, clear all these trees, turn it into this monoculture island that we know of now, that is now stripped of so many natural resources that it had originally. And that was all part of the process of bringing coerced people in and making them do this labor.
You mentioned religion briefly, and this plays out throughout the book. Religion plays a big part. Who is quote unquote superior because of their religion, and what religion, and converting the enslaved Africans, the indigenous. Can you talk about that a little bit?
That's a huge question, though, isn't it? So I will say, well, it's part of it is it's this idea of how do we, and I say we as in Europeans, how are Europeans justifying colonization? And one of the ways they're doing that early on under the Iberian powers is this idea that they're getting, papal decrees to support this, that they are going to Christianize the world, and particularly any territory that is not already under the control of a Christian prince is up for grabs, because that is seen essentially you're not a member of the true religion. The true religion is Christianity. It is our job to be essentially global ambassadors and to go out and spread this. But after the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, there are then all of these different factions. So you've got the English, who ultimately, by the time of Elizabeth, believe they are the ones who should be planting the true religion, and that true religion is Protestantism. And they start to define Catholics and anyone who is spreading Catholicism as someone who's actually undermining this work of spreading the true faith. And so the Catholics and the Protestants are, at war essentially in the 16th, 17th centuries and beyond. But they're at war over this much larger sense of global religious control. Who it will set up an empire that will be the empire that actually, dominates in terms of territory, but also in terms of ideology, and who will actually find people. And this particularly relates to indigenous people that they've only just learned about in the late 15th century, essentially, and convert them. And that is, I think, a fantasy that they have. And it really is completely different than what happens on the ground. In their fantasies and in propaganda, there's this idea that the English are going to come to a place like Virginia, and they're going to work with the Powhatans and other indigenous groups, and they're going to set up fair trading relationships, and they're going to be partners, and they're going to lead them towards the true faith, and all of this crap that we know does not end up being the case at all. And that in doing so, they will be superior to the Spanish who have committed acts of genocide and slavery and all of these things, which becomes part of this black legend that is used to justify English colonization. But we know from looking at centuries of English colonization that religious justifications remain front and center. But again and again, they are pushed aside for commercial goals, financial aims, greed, and then also just people on the ground in these colonial spaces ignoring idealistic orders from London. Even in the 17th century, someone like King Charles II, who is investing in the transatlantic slave trade, who is supporting the spread of slavery, he still thinks, well, maybe we should really be converting people. We should be converting enslaved people and Native Americans, because that's just part of what we should be doing as creating an English Protestant empire. But this is not popular among planters who actually are purchasing people and do not want them to learn to read and write. They do not want them to be Christian. They don't want them to be exposed to these ideas about spiritual freedom. And they also like the kind of theoretically clean distinction between Christians and heathens, that if you're Christian, you can't be enslaved. If you're heathen, you can. But, it's much messier on the ground. People are, some of them getting converted secretly. Some of them are learning about Christianity and are interested in it. And then there's also all sorts of other fringe religious groups like the Quakers, who are also trying to spread the gospel to enslaved people and Native Americans, which ultimately leads people in the Anglican Church to follow their lead in the early 18th century and start arguing that, we really do need to start doing this. And so anyway, it's a long story, I think, and it's definitely in more detail in the book. But what I find really striking about that story is the continuity of religion throughout this whole situation, whether it is used to justify slavery and to justify the continued brutalization of people over time, or it is then later used to justify abolition and ultimately emancipation. All of these different groups point to religion and say, any profit we're making, nonetheless, there's still this religious justification. And so that is an element of the story that you just cannot separate from the rest of it.
It is a very big part of the story, and peppered throughout the book, there are times where religion crops up as a moral should we be doing this? Is it against the morality of my religion? But then they continue on and justify it through several different means. So George, was it George III who had some sort of misgivings
Mm.
around,
George III, yeah.
is this something we should be doing? But then decided that this was slavery was just meant to be.
That it was a necessary evil.
Yeah.
Right, right. And George III in particular is a case study we can look at because we have his surviving notes from this is when he was from the 1750s when he was Prince of Wales. And so he was being tutored and being given all of these classic Enlightenment texts by people like Montesquieu. And essentially, Montesquieu had written in the Spirit of the Law, is one of the chapters of his book looks at justifications for slavery and kind of mocks them, essentially. And so George III is reading this and he is taking notes. And it's clear from his notes that he has come to the realization that all of these different justifications that have been used by Europeans to enslave Africans really are invalid. They're not, we can't really take them seriously. But at the same time, he, in just a few years later, inherits this massive and expanding Atlantic slave empire. And we know from the course of his reign that he continues to support slavery, that he uses enslaved people in various ways, and that he's essentially viewing them as commodities and as instruments at his disposal. So whatever he might think in his heart of hearts, it doesn't affect him. It doesn't change the way he acts. And I think that that is what we really should be thinking about when we're looking at the history of colonization, period, because there are a lot of lofty things that people put on paper that we can look back at, but then we have to look at their actions. How did their actions align with what they claimed they were doing or what their goals were allegedly were? And in so many cases, they conflict. My husband is Australian, and one of the things that we talk about a lot is that by the time Australia is colonized in the late 18th century, again, the English are like, well, we're going to do this totally differently. We are going to be so kind to Aboriginal people. We are not going to repeat the mistakes of the past. And they do. Absolutely, the same mistakes, the same level of racism, of, brutalizing people, oppression, genocide. I mean, it all happens again and again, despite these lofty goals.
There is a part of this history early on with Cromwell and with English people indenturing themselves that oftentimes comes up as, oh, well, it wasn't just the enslaved Africans that were doing this work, but sometimes it was the English or the Irish. And it is a point that comes up quite often.
Yes. And it also is based on a misunderstanding of what indentured servitude is and also penal servitude. Because, for example, the Irish, prisoners of war, vagrants, as they were called at the time, people who were unhoused, even someone who was just young and orphaned would be, against their will, shipped off to a place like Barbados. And Barbados actually became known for this and, treated appallingly, but they were nonetheless subject to limitations on the amount of time that they would spend in that condition. And it was not hereditary. So usually, if you were just an indentured servant, your contract could range from, 3 to 5 years. Typically, it was more like 4 to 5. And if you were in like an outline case, sometimes you could be subject to servitude for up to 7 years. And that is a long time, especially when people don't live that long in the 17th century. But it is not hereditary slavery, and it is not racialized in the way that African slavery ends up being racialized in around the same time period in the 17th century. And so there is definitely mistreatment of the poor, of people who are marginalized or who are the wrong religion or on the wrong side of a political conflict. But they're not en masse treated as commodities in the same way that Africans are. When Africans are initially brought to a place like Barbados, they are subject to different laws. And that is where looking at the legislation from the era is really helpful. If you look at the evolution of the servant, they were called the servant and slave codes. So these are essentially rules for masters to follow in the treatment of their, employees. and so-called property that they own. And it would essentially say, you can do this with them, you can't do this. If they're enslaved, you have this much power. And it's very clear that they have a lot of power over all of these groups, but they have virtually unlimited power over enslaved people. And then as they start to realize how extensive this power really is on the ground, what it really looks like in custom, that's when they start bringing more enslaved people in, because people who are indentured, as soon as they are free, would leave. They would leave the island. There's no opportunity for them. There's no land. There's no way to make a living. And so there's not a lot of people willingly wanting to work in the sugar fields or to harvest. They're just not wanting to do this once they've seen how treacherous this work is, how dangerous it is, and how brutal these enslavers and masters are in these places that are so concerned about profiting. But enslaved people have no choice. They're trapped. They cannot leave. They're not in a situation where they can work and essentially, make money and purchase themselves. That was very rare. And so it creates this system where ultimately slave labor becomes more profitable. It's something that is in the long run that they can exploit. And they start to rely on the transatlantic slave trade to a significant extent. So places like Jamaica, which is the largest and most valuable Atlantic imperial holding that the British have, it's like 90% of the population is enslaved, but most of that population has been replenished by the transatlantic slave trade, by those arriving slaving vessels, not through family formation and reproduction and children and any kind of natural sense of population growth. And so it's a very stark reality when you look at the difference between slavery and a slave society and people who are enslaved versus servants who might have had hard lives and were definitely not treated well, but had a time frame on that treatment and were still white. And being white was its own privilege, and it became more and more of a privilege over the 17th century, to the point that you've got people who are overseers and accountants and people filling all of these critical staffing roles on the plantation. They're white, and they might have been in a very precarious situation in England, but in a place like Jamaica, they've actually got some social clout and they've got some power and wealth that they would never have at home.
We talked about Queen Elizabeth giving her thumbs up and resources to Hawkins, but there's they went from just dabbling into the transatlantic slave trade to then becoming the most prolific in this space. And I know you can't tell us everything right now, but how does that happen?
Yes, and that is really the key question. And the best way to summarize it, it would be that initially you have, like, as you mentioned, the sporadic investment. They're dabbling, they're interested, they're chartering these monopoly companies that are getting involved in all kinds of commerce overseas, and that ultimately start to then dabble themselves in the transatlantic slave trade. But after the restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660, and in that intermission era where Cromwell and Parliament are working together to expand the Navy, which is a very critical part of the story, even though he's not a monarch, he actually contributes to the royals becoming involved in slavery and expanding the transatlantic slave trade, because he essentially bequeaths them this Navy that is really large and valuable. And so Charles II, he doesn't have money, but he has vessels at his disposal. And so they initially set out to, like some of their predecessors, find gold. They're hoping they can just strike it rich and not put in any effort. And obviously that is, a fantasy, like so many other fantasies of colonialism. But very soon after, in the 1630s, they're realizing we can bring enslaved people to our colonies in places like the Chesapeake, Virginia, Maryland, eventually the Carolinas, eventually Georgia as they expand into the 18th century, and into places like Barbados, Jamaica, the Leeward Islands, where they're clamoring for laborers, and they actually really want laborers that they can keep in hereditary lifetime servitude. So there's different ways they can profit. They can profit from the slave trade itself, from investing in the slave trade and making profit through that, but also from the expansion of the enslaved labor force in the English Atlantic Empire, which will then lead to more agricultural production, And so you're going to have more output, which is then shipped back to England. And then they can skim customs revenue off of that. So basically, like tax revenue off of these products that are produced by enslaved labor. So all of that is going on in the 17th century. And not all of it is as lucrative as they hope, because sometimes there are moments when like companies faltered because, they're not actually getting that much money. They're trading on credit and they're not actually getting money from planters, or they get sucked into a war with the Dutch. This happens with the Royal Adventurers. But ultimately, by the end of the Stuart era, by the end of the 18th century, it's very clear that slaving is extremely profitable and that there's a lot of other industries that can benefit as well through this whole infrastructure. So, for example, in the 18th century, there's an explosion of slave trading by people who are not members of a monopoly company, because Parliament opens up the slave trade to pretty much anyone. And because of that, you have the making of these major outports like Liverpool and Bristol, and entire industries that emerge out of this. So there are people who are involved in underwriting, like insurance, in shipping, in repairing ships, in banking, in all of these different retail outfits, in providing textiles and firearms and brass goods and things that Africans will want to trade in order to then purchase enslaved people. So all of these different networks pop up in the 18th century. And because they open the slave trade up, many, many, many people get involved. And so it's really, in terms of the British becoming the dominant players, with the exception of the Portuguese and Brazil, in the larger transatlantic slave trade, it had everything to do with ending that monopoly control. Because once you allow for basically free enterprise, then everyone is trying to get a piece of this and profit. And I think that is also part of the story that is difficult for a lot of people who are British to deal with. That this is a book obviously about the monarchy, but they're just the key players for part of the story, and they're absolutely invested in this and profiting and defending the system. But there were a lot of other people involved at every level as well. And that is one of the reasons why George III has these ambivalent feelings, because he knows there are all of these different subjects that he has that have invested interests in the continuation of this system, both the slave trade itself, but also slavery and colonization and all the rest of it. It's become part of how people are making money, and it's part of racial capitalism in the 18th century. And so this much larger 18th century expansion of empire is intertwined with the expansion of slavery. And slavery, there's the slave trade, which increases in volume in the 18th century, but then there's also slavery itself, which is expanding in what is now the United States, expanding throughout the Caribbean. And even after the 7 Years' War, when there's opportunities to maybe think, do we really want to, take some of these new colonies, like St. Vincent is one, where we could basically think twice about the type of system we want to create here. We could have a bunch of people with like small farmholds and actual indentured servants from the British Isles. They ultimately end up bringing, again, more enslaved people, because it's seen as a system that is quick to implement and will give them financial rewards rapidly. And that's what investors want.
When we talk about investors, the Royal Crown, they don't have money. In fact, a lot of times they're in debt, but they have resources, and there are subscribers who offer up money. Who are some of these subscribers?
So during the 17th century, when we're looking at like the Royal Adventurers and the Royal African Company, so Charles II, who was the king, he subscribed to both of those companies, but he mostly did not pay his subscription. And he was constantly being harassed by members of the company saying, are you ever going to pay your subscription? And instead, he would basically lend them ships. Or he tried to pay in kind, because what he wanted was for this investment to pay off without him having to actually give them money. But his younger brother, James, Duke of York, he was a major subscriber. He was the largest shareholder in those companies and the governor of that company. The king's wife, Queen Catherine, she was also a subscriber. The king's mother, his sister, they had a cousin, Prince Rupert. So a lot of members of the royal family are actually putting money into these slave trading companies to profit off of them, as well as members of the aristocracy. And then a lot of people who are part of like what we would see as like the merchant class. They end up becoming more dominant in the Royal African Company, like part two in the 1670s. So the royals are still investing, but the company itself is primarily run by people who are merchants and people who are investing in a lot of different companies. And so even someone like James, Duke of York, he's also heavily invested in the East India Company, in the Hudson Bay Company, in the Royal. So he's trying to make money basically out of overseas empire and overseas trade in a variety of different ways. Like he just wants money. And some of this money is money that we would see as personal. You know, it's his own money. But then there's money that they're also making through things like customs revenue that actually is part of the institutional structure of the monarchy, that is part of the ordinary income of the monarch. It goes into the royal treasury. And so part of tracing these connections between the monarchy and slavery over time is trying to kind of unravel, if you can, where's the money going? Is it like pocket money for the Duke of York, or is it actually contributing to like the birth of the fiscal state? And what I argue in my book is that it's both. There's clear moments when they're profiting on a personal level. We don't necessarily know what they did with that money. Like James was given multiple purses of gold, lots of gold. It's just as a reward to say thank you for, you know, your patronage of this company. You know, I'd love to know, what did he do with that money? What did he buy? Did he invest it in something? You know, we don't really know. And that to me is a really fascinating aspect, like some of these larger questions that are harder to answer. But because of the expansion of this whole system, they're also making money that's going in and strengthening the institution itself. And so that is part of the larger story. And then by the early 18th century, when essentially Queen Anne is on the throne, she's the one who ends up gaining the asiento, which is the contract to deliver enslaved people to Spanish America. She passes that contract to the South Sea Company, but she also invests in the South Sea Company, again, loans them ships, but then dies. And so she dies before this can really get off the ground. But her successor, George I, you know, he arrives from Germany, and he also immediately invests in this company. He agrees to be ultimately the honorary governor, as does his son, the Prince of Wales. Both invest heavily in this company. And so there's a lot of things happening even well after the Royal African Company, so into the 18th century, where they're still trying to profit from slavery and slave trading. And even once there is a complete changing of the guard, when you have the Stuarts chased out of England because they're seen as too potentially absolutist, too tyrannical, too Catholic, the people who replace them, who are the Protestant Hanoverians, they're also interested in making money off of slave trading and slavery. And so there is actually a lot of continuity there. Even though it may not seem that way when you just look at, well, this company is called the Royal African Company, and then, oh, it's, you know, it kind of declines and is not that significant. But if you also look at the evidence, it's very clear that even throughout the 18th century, the Royal African Company continued to petition the monarchs for aid. They didn't always get what they wanted. The South Sea Company petitioned them, but these slave trading companies knew that if they could get the monarchy on their side, that was an important patron. And also the monarchy, they have control over military and over naval deployments and over convoys and things like that. And so there is this connection between these companies and the monarchy itself as an institution well into the 18th century.
So on the podcast, we talk specifically about the Caribbean, and throughout this time frame, the Americas includes what is the United States as well as the Caribbean, and it's a little bit hard to parse out one from the other. You've mentioned Barbados and Jamaica. At what point does it ramp up with the transatlantic slave trade to the Caribbean?
Oh, so to the Caribbean, that's really very early because that is their primary destination in the 17th century. That is, and actually the Royal African Company, the people who are the factors, and these are the people who are actually trading in enslaved people on the ground. The reason I'm mentioning Barbados and Jamaica is because that is where they were. That's where they're primarily were located, in Barbados and Jamaica. And the South Sea Company also had its agents based in Barbados and Jamaica. So those were the sort of the two main sites. And Greg O'Malley, who's been on your podcast, right? His book is about essentially how Barbados was the entryway basically to the Americas, where incoming slaving vessels would arrive in Barbados and then be redistributed around. Some of them would go to like the Chesapeake, and some of them would go to South America, and some of them would go to the Leeward Islands or wherever. But these were the primary sites. And so the Chesapeake planters were actually unhappy and complained that they were not getting enough access to enslaved people. And this went on throughout the 17th century. But once the slave trade is opened up in the 18th century, there is obviously a surge of vessels coming in to the Leeward Islands, Barbados, and Jamaica, but also to the Chesapeake. And that is revealed in looking at the slave voyages database, where you can see the number of voyages arriving and people, disembarking in those areas, but also in the revenue the customs revenue, because once they have more enslaved laborers working on tobacco plantations and eventually over time, like cotton plantations, rice plantations, they are making more products, which are then returned to England. And then there's customs revenue on that ends up being part of state revenue. So all in the 18th century, all of these different places are getting more. But still, the Caribbean is still, and South America, 95% of slave vessels went to those areas. And so when you look at it in the long run, and that is actually what initially my editor wanted me to call this book something about America. And I said, but this is not about him. Like, this book is really more about the Caribbean than it is about America. Absolutely. Plus, that's my primary area of interest. First book was on Jamaica. I think it's such a fascinating region. And it's also where the vast majority of people went and where the vast majority of people were enslaved. And so I think, to me, it is the heart of the story. And it's also why even now, that's where some of the loudest voices are, who are calling for things like an acknowledgement of this history, repair for this history, because it affected so many people and they were the dominant part of the population. But just to go back to that earlier question for a second, what is also a fascinating part of this story is that by the time of the American Revolution, like right around then, people in the Chesapeake are saying, well, we don't want the transatlantic slave trade. We tried to cut it off. You are forcing us to continue to buy enslaved people. And they accuse George III of this. This is one of the things that Thomas Jefferson accuses George III of in the draft of the Declaration of Independence, which ended up getting cut. But that's only because they had already benefited from the explosion of slave trading that had been going on for decades. And essentially their population was self-sustaining in a way that never happened in a place like Jamaica. Because the mortality rate was so incredibly high in Jamaica, they were absolutely reliant upon the transatlantic slave trade. And so, yeah, you really have to kind of distinguish between which region are we looking at. And even the colonies themselves, like Barbados, had a little bit more parity in terms of demographics, to where there really was somewhat of a white settler society there. Like, the population was growing. There was more white women. In a place like Jamaica, that was not the case. It was, heavily enslaved people. And so one of the key things that I noticed when I was researching this book was that even George III, during the American Revolution, when he's so concerned about losing the 13 colonies, he is absolutely obsessed with protecting and defending Jamaica and Barbados, which he calls like the key properties, or the key territories of this empire, because he knows that it is sugar and these slave colonies that are essentially financing empire. And he's very aware of that. And that's also, again, why he puts his moral qualms aside when it comes to, the question of, is there really a justification for slave trading or slavery at all?
There is so much detail in this book, and I encourage anybody who's interested to read it, because when the conversation starts to come about the abolition of slavery, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a very long time, and there are some really interesting key players who help move that movement along.
Yes, and in my book, I talk about Ottobah Cugano and Aquilano and Mary Prince. But I love to be able that was probably for me my favorite part of the book to write, because so much of the book is about tracking complicity and investments and moments when different choices could have been made. But by the time of the abolition era, finally there's more voices of people of African descent and more people who are leaving behind records that you can access. And not only their published writings, Kugano wrote this amazing book about the evils of the slavery and the slave trade that he published and was, he tried to send it to George III and the Prince of Wales and politicians and all sorts of other influential people. But there's also surviving letters that he wrote to members of the royal family. And it's just amazing that we have those records because we're able to see not only that he was involved in the abolition movement and that he knew people like Granville Sharp and that Equiano and Kugano knew each other and were part of this group known as the Sons of Africa. And their whole goal was to essentially educate the British public, to write letters to the newspapers, to go on lecture tours, and essentially have people understand this is what slavery is. This is what the transatlantic slave trade actually looks like. I'm a formerly enslaved person, and I'm telling you from eyewitness experience what this was like. This is not a benevolent institution or any of these things that they had romanticized. And that, I think, is why this movement was so effective. Obviously, we needed these key players like Clarkson, Granville Sharp, Wilberforce, because they're able to grease the wheels of politicians. They know people in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. They've got all these connections, but they need these eyewitness accounts. They need people to actually convey the personal, emotional experience of what slavery is. And to me, that's a really important part of the story. And also the idea that the members of the royal family were appealed to by these abolitionists and by people who were formerly enslaved. And they could have done something radical. They could have supported them. They could have supported them in the House of Lords, but they didn't. Instead, you have people like Prince William, the Duke of Clarence, who is ultimately William IV, speaking out in favor of slavery. He's pro-slavery. He's buddy-buddy with the West Indian lobby. The Jamaica Assembly loves him. They're giving him all these gifts. He is the darling of all of these different companies, the West India merchants and planters, and people in Liverpool and stuff like that are naming slaving vessels after him. Instead, that is what's happening in this time period. And I don't think most people know that story. I mean, even in the UK, most people are very unaware of what was happening kind of behind the scenes during abolition, because the abolition story is typically a positive story of everybody rallied and the public was involved and all these petitions and, it was this wonderful thing. And then, we were at the vanguard. Period. And there's not actually enough discussion about, well, who was pushing back behind the scenes or even publicly, like the Duke of Clarence, and what was going on the ground by these activists to try to raise awareness at the same time that they're just being ignored. And so I think it just adds a bit of nuance and complexity to the story.
I agree. I think in much of the research that I've done, it's, slavery happened and then it was the abolition of slavery and the British were stopping the ships and freeing these enslaved people. And that's sort of the narrative that tends to be out there, but it is much more nuanced. There is so much more to the story than just, oh, we freed the enslaved people.
Right. And there's some good scholarship, too. I was just thinking about this while we're talking about Michael Taylor wrote a book called The Interest. And his book is about the interest as in the people who are in the establishment who don't want the slave trade to be abolished or who are anti-emancipation. So that's also a good read, really interesting. And then Padraig Scanlon, he wrote a book which is about a really great book, actually, which is about this idea that when the British were liberating Africans from slaving vessels beginning in 1808, that they were just letting them free. And his book is about no, this is not what happened. Instead, people were forcibly conscripted in the military. People were forced to be apprentices in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, and places like that. They were essentially forced to pay off the debt they owed to the British Crown for freeing them. And I talked about that in my book as well, because I think it's again another part of this story that is underappreciated and little known, because the emphasis is always on people are free and this is a great thing. And this is a part too of the culture wars in the UK, where even if like monuments to enslavers have been taken down, like people like Edward Colston in Bristol, for example, protesters tore down his statue. And so people aren't necessarily defending his statue, but then they're like, well, let's make instead a monument to the Royal Navy, because the Royal Navy did all of this great stuff. And that has taken on a life of its own. And I keep seeing it pop up everywhere. But as my book reveals, and as other books on the slave trade reveal, this is a long story. And actually, the Royal Navy was involved in a lot of slave trading activities for centuries, in trafficking itself, in providing convoy protection, in attacking the forts of other slaving countries in order to take their trade and to dominate the transatlantic slave trade, and then ultimately in freeing people, but then forcing them back into service to the British Crown. So it's a messier picture than we would like. And I think that's to me what makes history so valuable to study and to read, is that nothing is usually as simple as we've been led to believe. And even for researchers, you go into a topic and you have an idea in mind of what you're going to find, and then you're typically surprised by what you find. Like you might think, oh, in the Royal Archives, there's all of this stuff about slavery. And really, there's not that much at all. This is a really heavily curated collection, and you have to go out to other archives instead to find the answers to some of the questions that you have. To me, that's why I like history. I love writing history. I like reading history. And I also feel like there's so much more to uncover, and we're never going to be at like the end of the story. It's just this ongoing conversation about like, well, here is one piece of the puzzle that someone has figured out and is working on. And, how can I contribute to that larger narrative? So I fully suspect, for example, that people in the coming years will find so many other aspects of royal involvement in slavery, because there's so much. And my book covered hundreds of years, and I didn't have a team of forensic accountants. So I'm like really excited about the thought of, will the king ever actually employ researchers? Will he ever spend some of his multi-billion-pound fortune to really dig into this? Because I think we're at the tip of the iceberg to some extent in looking at these links. They're clearly there. They're extensive, and I think they should be acknowledged. But I also think there's probably more that we don't even know about yet.
I think we're in a time where people are starting to really dig into it and uncover some of these records that are kind of hidden, so that we can get a better idea of the history. And again, your book is so full of information that I, amongst other research, had never even heard of before.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know from your perspective, why does all of this matter?
Great question. As someone who researches the history of slavery and teaches this, what I'll say too. So when I was in grad school, I started off being interested in like empire, kind of as a abstract concept. But then while I was working on that, I started researching more about slavery. And I thought, what is a topic that is going to kind of give me something to think about for hopefully the rest of my life, that I'm not going to be like, I'm sick of thinking about this because I don't think it, but that was one topic I thought, this is never going to decline in significance, because the legacies of slavery are still with us and ever present. And I think that like essentially the present day realities that we live with, the inequalities that we see, the legacies of, if you look at racial violence, if you look at even things like infrastructure, debt cancellation issues going on in the Caribbean, the fact that the environment was completely destroyed, and now there are many of these different islands now, countries are reliant on hospitality and tourism, which also, again, is bad for the environment. They've been put in this cycle that is very hard to get out of and goes back hundreds of years. And there's so much research now, too, on basically wealth. And Dorothy Brown wrote this book. She's a legal scholar, called The Whiteness of Wealth. And the point of her book is about inheritance and how property is inherited through families over time. And when you look at enslaved people, they were not given anything. They were given themselves, and that was all. Whereas people who were enslaving them were compensated. and given all of this money, which perpetuated the racial and wealth inequalities that already existed, and have continued to the present day. So to me, this is essentially, if you want to know more about the creation of the modern world, about the inequalities you see all around us, but also why people are pushing for an acknowledgement of this history and why they're actually arguing for reparations, for example, this is, I think, an important book to read. But also, if you maybe are interested in the monarchy and you don't know much about it, or you've only read the, more fun aspects of the story, this, in my opinion, is a bit of like the little darker aspect of monarchy. But I also think it's also, when you read it, it's somewhat obvious in the sense that you're like, well, obviously, here's an institution based on the whole idea of hereditary privilege. So we cannot look to an institution based on hereditary privilege for radical egalitarian ideas or humanitarian. They need to be pushed. Well, they're not going to push in a direction that we want them to go. Like, they are going to respond very slowly to change, just as they did to abolition agitation, anti-slavery, all of that took decades to have an effect. And so I think that when we look at the monarchy now, it is still an institution that responds so incredibly slowly. Like when William says he wants to modernize the monarchy, it's like letting somebody wear shorts instead of pants. Or, it's like something so minor, but for them, it's a really big deal because it's been for generations. This is how it's always been done. So anyway, I find all of that to be definitely worthwhile and fascinating, and also the overlap between empire and institutions, and like the institution that defines British national identity, which is the monarchy still. And it's why this book is still getting attacked in the British conservative press. Just last week, it was like another review about how horrible my book is. And I am always like, wow. And I will like skim them, but I don't spend a lot of time on them because it's a bad faith argument that they're making because they don't care about the evidence. Instead, they want to say things like, well, the Royal Adventurers didn't really make that much money. This company went under. So Newman is making a flawed argument. I'm like, okay, so the thousands of people who were sold into slavery, forget about them. It doesn't matter. And so that to me, I just find that really troubling that they're coming at these arguments for a way to essentially undermine the validity of this historical record and the story itself. And I don't think, King Charles doesn't need them to do this. He doesn't need these conservatives like defending him because, and if anything, they're just making the monarchy look bad, as though the monarchy cannot take criticism and it cannot take reality, which is what these documents reveal, and only really probably part of the story. I mean, there's probably so much more that didn't survive the process. We only have the evidence that survives. And so I always imagine this is probably far more extensive than we're even able to dig into based on what has actually survived over the centuries.
I did an episode with the Repair Campaign, and we talked about CARICOM's 10-point plan for reparations. When it comes to reparations, do you have any hope of what King Charles will do?
Well, as a historian, and one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I hope the Crown and the King himself will acknowledge this history. That's the first step. I mean, and that's actually part of CARICOM's plan as well, like formal acknowledgement. Without that, nothing else can be done. And obviously, it has to be done in conjunction between the British government and the monarchy, because King Charles is a constitutional monarch. So he needs to do this, with the consultation of whoever is PM. But my concern is that thus far, both the Labour government, the Conservative government, none of them are really willing to take on this issue. And if they're not, then there is no reason for the King to pursue even just acknowledgement. And so I think that we need really public education. And essentially, I was sitting in the audience of an event recently on reparations, and somebody was talking about like mainstreaming reparations, the concept. And I think that's a good point. Essentially, that this is not some kooky idea or some outlying fringe movement, that it's actually about acknowledging harm and essentially, acknowledging complicity and profit, and then agreeing essentially to have a conversation with descendants and see what repair will look like, because it can take so many different forms, and it's never just about money. It's never just something you could boil down to financial figures, or even that could even be possible to take, millions of people's lives and say, well, they're worth this much. That's offensive, just the idea of that. But I do think that just getting to that first step would be something that I would personally love to see. But I also don't want it to happen in isolation. Like, I don't want the monarchy and the government at some point to just be like, oh, well, this happened and it was such a shame. And then that's it. Like, the whole thing is shut down and they feel like they've done enough, because I don't think that's the case. And I definitely don't think members of the Repair Campaign or CARICOM or Pan-African groups or any of these other groups who are pushing for acknowledgement and repair will be satisfied with that. They want a seat at the table, and they want to be part of the conversation of what this repair would look like.
This has been a very expansive discussion, and we didn't even cover a quarter of what's in the book. So I encourage everybody to take a look at the book and some of your other work. Where can people find all of your work?
Definitely in bookstores, independent bookstores, bookshop.org, which you can purchase books from independent bookstores, which I think is amazing. I also have a website, which is brookennewman.com, and there's links to my book and different writings. I'm also on Instagram under Dr. Brooke Newman, and I'm on Blue Sky. But I'm definitely not on X. I've not been on X for years, and I will not go back. Will not.
I will leave links to your website and to the book and to some of your other writings in the show notes, as well as to your Instagram. I appreciate you taking the time to come on and share some of this information with us. Again, we just scratched the surface of this whole conversation, but your book covers how many years?
Hundreds. It's basically mid 1550s through like 1840. And then I also go back a little bit further into the 15th century and also into the present day. So it's hundreds and hundreds of years of history.
Brooke, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you. I love talking to someone who is so knowledgeable, but also has interviewed so many other people who work in such a variety of fields and everything. So yeah, your podcast is great.
Thanks for joining me for today's episode of the Moorish Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. It really does help in getting the podcast in front of more people. Follow on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube for videos and more. And I'll see you for the next episode.